Greetings, 6th grade parents and students. Mr. Korn here again. The next skill that's important to our new unit is how to turn fractions to decimals. In one of the videos, we talked about turning decimals and other numbers into fractions, but now we're going the other way with it. We're taking a fraction and we're turning it into a decimal. There's an easy way to do this, but at first I need the students to understand what we call a conceptual way of doing this. Now, fractions such as 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, and 1/5 are what's called common fractions. These are fractions that students eventually will be able to mentally compute into a decimal in their head. Okay? So, with time and practice, students will begin to recognize the decimal forms of 1/4 and 1/2 and 3/4 and 1/5 and so on. But for now, we need to learn the basics. How and why do these numbers equal the decimals that they do? Well, let's take a look. Let's look at the fraction 1/4 to begin. Let's turn 1/4 into a decimal. Well, 1/4 means I got to take something and I got to divide it into 4 equal parts. Okay? So what we talked about in class is that this square represents all the decimals. So this giant square is equal to 1, such as $1. Could be 1 anything. But it represents the whole number. A dollar is what we talked about in class. So if this whole square equals $1, then that means it's split up into decimals. Each row is equal to a tenth, 1/10, 0.1, just like one dime. And each little tiny square is equal to 1/100th, same as 1 penny. And of course there's 100 squares total, so that's why these squares each could equal 1/100th, because there's 100 little squares in the whole square. So let's focus on turning 1/4 into a decimal. So first thing we have to do is we have to split this square, which could be thought of as a whole. So we got to take our whole, or our dollar, and split it into 4 equal parts. And the reason it needs to be 4 equal parts is because our denominator in the fraction we're trying to change is a 4. So if you divide it this way, this is one way, but not the only way, to get 4 equal parts. You got to count to make sure each part is equal, and they are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows in each. Okay? But this represents equal parts. If we shade in 1/4, 1/4 represents one whole quadrant here, 1/4 of the square. And then what we simply have to do is count the little squares, thinking of each little square as a penny or 100th. So if we count each square, you'll count that there are 25 little squares in here. 25 of these, 25 hundredths. We can write 25 hundredths like this. 25. Oh, I'm sorry. We can write 25 hundredths like this. 0.25. And in our place value chart, 0.25. 25 hundredths. Now, if 1/4 is equal to 25 little squares, then let's skip over to this fraction, 3/4. So we still want to split our 100 square up into 4 equal parts, but this time we want to take 3 of the parts that we divided it. So here's one of them. Well, if I want 3 of them, I got to also shade in this portion and also shade in this portion. And then count the little squares in each, remembering that each little square is equal to 1/100th, 0.01. If I count each little square, I'll notice that there are 75 little squares shaded in order to represent 3/4. So 3/4 can be written as 75 hundredths. 0.75. Oh. And I'll write it better down here. 0.75. 75 hundredths. Okay? So we can follow the same process for almost any number. Let's try one of the others. I'm going to have to erase this because we're going to split it a different way now. But we can still think of each little square as a penny or a 1/100th. So I'm going to delete these lines. Oh, while we're here, let's do a half. So a half means we have to take our square and divide it into 2 equal parts, into halves. Pick one of the halves, such as this bottom, and think how many little squares are in there. Well, we can think of this in 2 ways, actually. We can count each little square, and we can say that there are 50 of them. 50 1/100ths. 0.50 hundredths. But if you'll notice that 50 hundredths is the same as 5 tenths. And here's why. 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, and 5/10. 5/10. But again, if I counted the little squares, it would be 50 of them, 50 hundredths. So 1/2 in decimal form can be written as 0.5. Because when we talk about decimals, if there's 0 at the end of each decimal, we don't need to even write the zeros. We just got to assume or know that they're there. Okay. Let's go back to our 1/5. We're going to talk about 1/5 now. So we have 3 decimals as fractions, and these are common decimals, and students will eventually commit these to memory. So keep practicing on those with your students. Now let's talk about 1/5. Okay? Well, 1/5 means is that we need to take the square and we need to divide it into 5 equal parts and then see what one of those parts is equal to. Alright? Well, here's our square. Let's divide it into 5 equal parts. Oops. If I divide it every 2, so I'll have to go here. This will move to here. Oop, that one was a little thicker. If you look, I divided it up evenly into 5 equal parts. Here's group 1, here's group 2, group 3, group 4, and group 5. So I have this into 5 equal groups, and that is what this denominator means. All I got to do now is count the hundredths or the tenths in each group. I'm looking for 1/5. So I'm simply looking for one of these groups. So let's just shade in one of them. If you'll count, you'll notice there's 20 hundredths or 1/2. 0.2. 2/10, that is if you're counting this in the rows, 1/10, 2/10, or if you're counting each little square individually, 20 hundredths. So 1/5 in decimal form is 0.2. If 1/5 is 0.2, 20 hundredths or 2/10, and that means 2/5 is going to be equal to 4/10 or 40 hundredths. 0.4. Or just erase that 2 and put a 4. 0 tenths, 0 ones, 4 tenths, 0 hundredths, or 40 hundredths. So that's the basics of turning a fraction into a decimal, but there's an easier way to do that. You can simply use your calculator. You can take the top number and divide by the bottom number. So if you take the top number, 1, and divide by 4, you'll get a decimal expansion for every number, and your calculator will give it to you. Sometimes you have to round, and sometimes you don't. But as long as you understand that you can take every fraction and do the numerator divided by the denominator, you'll be able to get the decimal expansion of any number. So if you take your calculator, or you want your student to practice, have them put 1/4 in, 1 divided by 4, and see what comes out. It'll be this. 1/2 will be this. 3/4, 0.75, and so on. This will help students commit these common fractions to memory. Now, let's look at whole numbers. When you have a mixed number, such as 2 1/4, or 2/5, all you have to do is understand that these whole numbers represent the wholes, the ones or the tens. So 2 1/4 tells me that there's a 2 in the ones place, 2 wholes. All we have to do now is change the 1/4 to a decimal. Well, you can take the calculator and do 1 divided by 4, and you'll get 0.25. So if we take our 2 wholes and add 0.25, you will get 2.25. 2/10 and 5/100. And the same would go for 3 2/5. If we know that 2/5 equates to 0.4, we just understand that 3 is our whole number, goes in front of the decimal, then our decimal point, and then we can evaluate the fraction. 2 divided by 5 equals 0.4. So 3 plus 0.4. And that equals 3.4. So that is how you can turn numbers into decimals, fractions to decimals. So now we've talked about turning decimals into fractions and fractions to decimals. Once again, reach out to me by email or phone if you have any questions. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.